It's very interesting because it seems like the older I get, the more in tune with the potential of Saturn I get. When I was young, I didn't want to have anything to do with money, right? I sort of hated money. Now I have a dislike of money and I don't want to be caught up in money, but I'm far more prudent. And I suppose becoming a parent obviously makes you more prudent because you got to be a realist about your child. You know, you got to be able to give it. For me, I didn't mind if I didn't have anything because, like, what did I need? I needed nothing. I was an idealist. All I needed was air to breathe, stars above my head, life, and I was happy. Now that I'm a father and I'm older, I've got to start thinking about more than myself. It's interesting as we get older, we're thinking about others more. When we're younger, we tend to be more selfish. Do you think that would be an accurate way of putting it?
Yeah, no, that's totally accurate. I think, yeah, when you get younger, because if you think about it, like when you first sort of just like incarnate into the human world, like you really only know your consciousness. Like those first 5 years of your life, they might as well just be some kind of like hallucinatory dream. But it's like as you kind of interact with life in the world, more so, you start to realize how conscious other people actually are, and that they are just as conscious as you are. They've thought a lot of the same thoughts, you know, that you have. Whereas when you're younger, you don't really have as much experience with other people. You don't have as much experience, with yourself. And what you do have, real experience you do have is things like books, movies, and television, and these platforms of idealization that you kind of look at yourself and you sort of see a potential. But like as Indy Sage, when you get older, you start to realize some of your dreams are not, all that realistic. But I think at the same time, you also kind of learn to accept the fact that, maybe things don't have to be, totally perfect in life, because when you're younger, you just kind of want like, you think it's so easy, like, oh my God, like, world peace. This is so obvious. Doy, just give money to the poor. But then as you get older, it's like, oh, there's all this other complicated stuff and all these other complicated variables that I haven't really, taken into consideration in terms of my analysis. And so from there, as you get older, you get a more like, you start to see more of the complexity of the world. You start to see more of its intricacies, and things are also there's more moral ambiguity. There's more gray, kind of areas in terms of like what's right and what's wrong. Whereas I think when you're younger, your thinking is also a lot more black and white because you're just so hyped up and emotional and idealistic. And, but that's something else I think it's when it comes to the activist type that you are sort of like talking about here, Franklin, is that they also tend to have a more black and white concept of morality. There's not a lot of middle ground. There's not a lot of, oh, maybe this is right in this situation. It's always a very firm stance, like this is the truth. This is the right thing to do. We have to do it this way. And it's very uncompromising in that sense. And yeah, and in a lot of ways, I think that can go in either really good direction or it can go in a really horrible direction.
I love, and I can apply that to myself. Everything you're saying, Cosmic, makes such beautiful sense. Eliciting like a practical perspective. Like my idea of the occult, if I go back, say 3.5 decades, right? And maybe just a bit more than 3.5, but say 3.5 decades, even then still. I had like grasped the Kabbalah and Hermetics, right? And I thought I was so on fire. Like I knew how the archangelic system works and the choirs of the archangels and the choirs of the angels and the 4 different color spectrums of the tree of life and the various different associated God names and the different nuances between the angelic and the archangelic. And I was mapping out these trees of life. I had all 4 trees of life mapped out, and that was it. It was so simple. I hadn't really appreciated Ein Sof or the Om Tat Sat yet. that was so deeply embedded within the Om. And it was later that I realized, hold on,
Thank you, little moron.
is that the whole story? Is there more? And I thought I had it all mapped out. I thought I knew it all. Like, I actually thought I was enlightened in 1997, 98. I thought that's it now. Sure, I'd had some like powerful experience. I'd managed to go out of my body. I'd managed to be out of my body for like what seemed like months, but it was like 6 hours. And I lived a whole nother chapter of a life out there, outside of my body. And I ended up in the abyss, and I ended up what I can only describe as fighting for my life. I mean, it's not like fighting; it's more like something else. And so I'd had this experience of overcoming this lower nature, and I'd come close with what people call, like, without getting biblical on you, the Christos had come and been inside me, and I was like, oh my gosh, I must be some special chosen one. I must have found this special thing inside myself. I must, and it was such a powerful experience that I thought this must be it. And I didn't realize that that's just like, it's just a taste. It's just a taste. It's just the first sort of, you've had the first taste of the cheesecake, mate. There's a whole piece of cheesecake ahead of you, mate. Just the corner. Wait, you have no idea what the rest of this cake tastes like. And I think it's a common thing that we're talking about here, because that activist within ourselves, I still notice myself becoming an activist today, by the way. I watch myself switching between the activist within me and the mystic within me. The mystic is when I'm sitting observing things and I don't have an opinion. The activist is when I have an opinion. And so I look at these two things within myself. Number 7 doesn't really have an opinion. 9 has got a very clear opinion. There's an ideal. That 8 has been compounded into the 9. 9 is reflecting the 6 and the 3 perfectly. It's ready to complete the story. And there's this element of perfectionism that moves between the number 1, between the number 9 and the number 1. So we see it here, right? When we look at it. It seems quite clear to me, that there's this definite thing going on here. I don't understand what just happened. So anyway, I don't seem to be able to put that image up. But there's this definite and very powerful connection between the power of 9 and the power of 1, in the way that the power of 9 becomes the power of 1. And that perfectionism is exasperated in Leo, being an expression, an ambassador of number 1. They want everything. They're a perfectionist. They tend to be quite hard. But that perfectionism starts in number 9, in that idealistic, this is the ideal. We've reached the completion now. We have the ideal of where the next cycle is going to go. This is where we want it to go. 1 is going to put into practice what 9 has figured out, right? This is how the wheel and the cycle turns. And so I'm not quite sure what's going on here. Seems to be some kind of an issue with this thing. But anyway, let me take that off. Maybe it'll be better. So I do think that when we look at ourselves, we'll see both of these elements working. And I think it's really important to realize, what do you guys think? Do you notice that within you, there's both of these? There's the activist and the mystic, and they're always sort of trying to get into the throne?
Yeah, I think in anything, in being something, if you say that you are a mystic, you can tell the difference between whether you're being and BSing, or you're really being, by how much you've done some doing. So how much practice you've had will determine how much of a mystic you really are. So you have to do some doing at some point in order to have some being, I would say. Oh, I think you might be muted.
No, I wasn't just I just wasn't saying anything. I think I also experienced this dichotomy to a certain extent. The sort of that the certain person who wants to be kind of like the activist, and the person who just kind of wants to be sort of internal. There's definitely kind of a struggle, you know, with that. But I think what I've been kind of interested in is like lately, I kind of, you know, it was interesting you bring up the whole enlightenment thing, Franklin, and this whole idea of sort of thinking you're enlightened. And I think the problem with believing that you're enlightened is that you no longer take steps to make yourself more enlightened. That once you think you've gotten to a certain state, it's like there's a sort of spiritual complacency that happens when you think you're God, you have everything figured out. And I think a lot of this has to do with how we perceive infinity. And the people who I think that tend to believe that enlightenment is legit, they tend to see infinity internally. They say, oh, my internal mindscape, this infinity is a direct copy of the, you know, the outer world, the external. And so because I understand the infinity within me, therefore I automatically understand all the infinity outside of myself. And so then you think, well, I'm God, I'm enlightened. And you can think of it as being God in the sense of like you individually are God, or you are part of one singular collective mind. But largely, it's kind of the same kind of process happens. I think what happens too is a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, I don't believe the individual. I'm part of the collective." But internally, there's still kind of a same experience of you are, you know, the universe and God. You just might not be the central node of that being. But with my study and my work, I kind of take an opposite approach when I think of infinity. I think of infinity more of I take the imagination and I externalize it. And when you externalize the imagination, it's more like an infinite upward progression of Russian nesting dolls. What I mean by that is like you sort of imagine the universe, and then you realize there's an edge to that universe, and there's the universe outside of that. And then they're part of a multiverse, and then you realize there's an edge of that multiverse, then there's a multiverse outside of that. And if there's a certain point where you keep going up and up and up, and your mind no longer has the ability to tangibly sort of process what's happening, and so then you kind of realize, wait, there actually sort of is a limit to my perception. I'm not quite as infinite as I thought I was, because it's like this infinity just keeps going. And even if I was all of it at once, it would take me an infinite amount of time to recognize that, because it's like a circle it's not just like the universe is like, it has an edge, but that edge is expanding at an exponential rate. But what's interesting though is that when you reach a certain limit, now I have a threshold and understanding of where I need to go next and how I progress further. And you can expand that understanding. You can expand that sense of being and stretch out even further than you did before, once you've integrated all the stuff that's, you know, sort of around you so far. And I think that in a lot of ways, this kind of this Fey perspective, which they call, they have a different word for it. They call it this. Always been fascinated with this word that kind of I channeled, called ozozo, which basically kind of means like an infinity beyond infinity, or the infinity beyond your idea or conception of what infinity is. It's just like it's to like Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. And with that kind of humility in perspective, and you realize you're not ever going to be enlightened, you know, you have this sort of sense of like, it's instead of being like a kind of a tyrannical sort of like egotistical person, you're constantly growing, you're constantly sort of evolving and sort of dimensionally expanding yourself. And it's a long process. But some people, they want to think, no, they got the whole thing all at once. They have it all figured out. But from my perspective, it's kind of like, you know, imagining some, like with the Zerfax and Zarfax thing, you think of the universe as bubbles. And so somebody who thinks they're enlightened is basically kind of like, it's like you can see the edges of their bubble, but they can't see the edges themselves. It's like a kind of like a hamster wheel where they keep sort of moving forward, but they never quite reach the actual edge or the side. So I think having that, so what I guess the conclusion that I'm saying with this is that, you know, it actually, a lot of people, you know, in the occult community, they say there really is no difference between, you know, looking at the infinite and the mystic in an internal perspective versus looking at it from an external perspective. But I think it actually is an important distinction, because what I'm finding is that exploring one or the other does lead to different metaphysical conclusions.